There's something that I'm particularly interested in here. There's this like notion of having this semantic document that's really describing either your view and or your content. Again, I had referenced the idea of GraphQL being an API surface area where people really try to embody this. They try to think about building their API where it represents sort of the, not the business logic, but the actual data structures that you're trying to show. And then you build your UI across many devices or surface areas. There's this tool that I don't think is maintained anymore, but there's this tool that I found a long time ago called JSONet. And it was this really interesting and fun idea where it's just like this blob of JSON that powered a native app. And I don't know what y'all's implementation is, but it sounds like you have some like semantic JSON and you're like serving these to clients. So I'd like to know a little bit more about what does this look like for building cross-platform compatibility? Like, what does it look like on your native clients?
The amount of engineers that have started since I have worked it into it and have sent me a link to JSONet, if I had $1 for each one, I could have retired by now. It's real close. It looks a lot like that. I think there's a couple differences to the structure, but that is the payload for describing a page looks a lot like that, at least as when it gets into the player, it does. There can obviously be build steps that do things before that. Adam was actually just playing around with like a JSX-like DSL the other day. But it basically looks like that. It's a JSON payload that starts with view and you sort of describe the layout, and that's true whether you're on the web or on iOS and Android.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, an interesting transition for engineers to make, especially I write React day in and day out. And when you're kind of swapping from that mind map of, I just want to write a button here, I want to write this, it's a different thing to then go and say, okay, I need to actually author like JSON, and that's my payload. And double checking that, it renders correctly is one of the steps, but it's also, is my data wired up correctly? And is all the kind of business logic set up in a sense where it's not platform dependent? Your end result is this payload that then gets shipped to an app that, can change the rendering on you without actually deploying a different piece of content. It's an interesting problem, especially when we can push an update to the player that changes the UI drastically for any of the platforms. And it's cool because it's one space to do it, but it's also a little scary when you're the one team in charge of the 10,000 pages and you have to make sure you're not going to break anyone.
I've got one more question, Andrew, and then I'll pass it back to you. But I have an opposite side of the question. So authoring JSON obviously is not the most...
It's amazing. I don't know what you're talking about.
What are you talking about, Justin?
You sort of mentioned that you have these tech professionals who are building up these data structures that probably like ultimately get translated into screens. What does that authoring experience look like? How do you handle that?
There's been a couple of attempts over the last several years since this thing was built. We do have some end user focused tooling where you can it's more of like a Visual Studio or even Figma like experience where you just put stuff in and drag and drop it, because it is ultimately a data payload. You could even take something and just like generate it, right? You could have a WYSIWYG editor that sort of, the reason for its existence is just to dump out a JSON payload. Even though like you have that, you still have to wind up touching it, right? Like a developer still has to go in and touch it, because even with a visual editor, there will be something that's not right, or you have to go in and update that JSON to do some bindings and stuff like that, add some more validations. And that's not a great experience, right? I think especially early on, we focused a lot on building capabilities for this stuff and just getting this right. And we didn't focus as much on the usability, the developer ergonomics of it. That's actually where a lot of our focus has been over the last year or so, is in saying, okay, this, we know, I know from experience, I've written a lot of this JSON myself. We know that this is not fun to write. As an architect at the company, I don't want my engineers that are working on this day in and day out to be unhappy, because an unhappy engineer is going to come yell at me the same way that I yelled at the architect before me. I want to make it better because I hate doing it and I don't want other people to hate doing it. So we've been working a lot on tools to make this stuff, like developer focused tools to make this stuff better, because ultimately, even if you do have an end user tool that's generating some JSON, someone has to go in and touch it. And that someone is going to be real upset every time they have to go do it if we don't make it better than just writing code inside strings, inside an array, inside a JSON file, which is as tedious and painful as it sounds.
Yeah, this is a space that I've like especially been starting to dedicate a whole lot of time to. There's actually some really cool, kind of scary projects that have come out of it. One, David mentioned, we were talking about writing our own JSX transpiler and actually creating all the components on a page as what you would author as almost a React component. Rather than, server-side rendering that to HTML, we're server-side rendering that to the JSON payload for the player. Having that kind of be your authoring experience, because we know a lot of people are super comfortable with that, especially at the company, like all of our front end is React. That gives us a build pipeline to generate the JSON in a way that we can actually validate and it be correct. I think one of the really difficult parts is because the actual JSON itself is so flexible, it is ridiculously hard to validate. When we talk about TurboTax has this set of components that it uses and its own kind of language to describe the UI. Mint has its own set. QuickBooks has its own set. Like every application defines their own semantics. So me as the library author, I can't make the assumption to say oh, you're running within this app, so here's what you have access to. I need the tools to be able to accept kind of this dynamic language configuration. And then all of the validations for, whether the payload or the JSX, everything needs to kind of learn from that. So one of the things that we struggled with early on and what we found was, documentation gets out of date really quickly. We know that we can write a React component to render the tile or the button, but that payload needs to match up with what users are writing in content. For as many times as you can document the props of a thing, it's always wrong. The only right implementation is the runtime one. So I've spent a whole lot of time actually writing tooling on top of the TypeScript compiler that generates all of these validations at build time, one of which will actually scrape all the interfaces for everything, bundle it, ship it to a language server that I wrote that can then validate the JSON dynamically using the TypeScript compiler. So it's this kind of full cycle of we want one source of truth, but then we want all of the tools in the right place to be able to accept, and dynamically change themselves based on what they need to do.
So just to dumb it down a little bit for users, what's the end user experience for a person in VS Code?
You get cool autocomplete in your JSON, which is actually powered by the types, as opposed to struggling with, we've all had the experience where you are in you're in a language and then you have to drop into something smaller. Think about the early days of GraphQL where the template strings wouldn't have their own special formatting and stuff like that. So you'd get just basically notepad.exe for that section of your code, and you've got real nice surroundings, and then you're back in I am editing nothing. I'm editing a plain text document now. And so we avoid that by doing all the stuff that Adam was talking about. And so you actually get full autocomplete for all the stuff that you expect. And so we guide the user through things, even though it still is just JSON. It's like JSON on steroids. And then that also helps with, a bunch of linting. So it's not just the language server, which enables editing. There's also linting tools or code mod tools that you could envision coming out of this. And if you have that built-in AST and you know all the types, then you can sort of expand from that one validation into a whole ton of other stuff that allows you to sort of modify the structure of that code. Because it is code, right? I mean, we're talking about JSON. It's data and code, which allows you to do a bunch of cool things.
Yeah, if you look at expressions, it's code.
Right.
Adam can tell you, he made it a syntax highlight.
I did. I wrote a few parsers for that.
So tell me about this expression thing.
I mean, anytime there's data manipulation involved, you want to change data. You want to move things around and rearrange and do everything. Because we're cross-platform, and it's actually the same core TypeScript library that runs on every platform, we need an expression language to be able to kind of do all of that, but do it in a both safe way, so we don't just call val in JavaScript or anything, but do it in a way that we can execute it on native as well. So we have essentially a subset of JavaScript. It's 99% the same syntax, and a whole lexer parser in order to interpret that and execute it and evaluate it into our data model and all that stuff. So in some cases, it is legitimately writing like, code within a string that gets shipped over, but trying to execute and evaluate all that as safely as we can.